Hi all, I'm back, and today for Gen Bio, we're going to talk about natural selection. Okay? Last time we talked about this man on the left, Charles Darwin, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the man on the right, which is Alfred Russel Wallace. Okay? Together, both these individuals came up with the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Darwin gets most of the credit, and I'll tell you, potentially why that is. But nonetheless, Alfred Russel Wallace deserves some credit for at least coining the term natural selection, but for his findings when it came to natural selection. Okay, so the theory of natural selection. Remember where I said before that Darwin, when he was suggesting natural selection, he was saying that organisms over-reproduce, and they have the capacity to do so. So not all their offspring are going to survive, only the ones that are best suited for the current environment. That concept is often referred to as the survival of the fittest. Now, fittest has a couple different meanings. In some cases, it does mean you actually are the most physically fit. So you're physically fit for that environment. You can swim the fastest, run the fastest, climb the fastest, jump the highest, etc. But in other cases, it has nothing to do with the actual fit of the individual, but it's rather what we call biological fitness. Okay? Biological fitness is very different than, say, like modern sociological fitness. Biological fitness refers to an individual's capability of passing on genetic material to the next generation. So if you have children, you have fitness. If you have grandchildren, you have more fitness. Okay? If your brother, sister, siblings have children, you have more fitness. If they have grandchildren, you have more fitness. And so fitness is a variable of how much of your genes, what percent of your genes are being passed on to the next generation and the next generation. Okay? And so you have to look at fittest in a couple ways. One, it's not always referring to the biggest and strongest. In today's society, it's not the biggest and strongest individuals that get to reproduce, typically, if we're talking about human societies. In human societies, mainly, it's the individuals that are most financially stable that are getting to reproduce. This is why you see that people are waiting much later in life to reproduce, is because they're obtaining financial stability before they reproduce. So it's not always about the biggest and strongest. Now, in some species, it has to be about the biggest and strongest because only the large individuals might reproduce, or only the fast individuals might reproduce. And so it depends on the organism, for sure. Survival of the fittest, however, this concept has been taken out of context in many ways to either say that Darwin would have been in support of things like genocide or things like concentration camps and things like that, because the fittest individuals, the ones that have the biggest guns, etc., are the ones that are going to survive. But that is not the case. Charles Darwin would have said that that is not natural selection. Nature's not doing the selection. Humans are doing the selection. And that's artificial selection, and it's not part of the theory of natural selection. Right? It has its own premise and its own regulations. And Charles Darwin, for information that's probably not common knowledge, even in the 1800s, when slavery was very, very common, Charles Darwin did not have slaves and was opposed to slaves, and writes about in many times in his different books, including Emotion of Man, that there is no difference between individuals with black skin or white skin. And so Charles Darwin was against slavery, and therefore would probably not have been for things like concentration camps or genocide and things like that. It's hard to ask him. He's been dead for 200 years or so. Well, not quite 200 years, but all right. So fitness is based on evolutionary theory. Okay? It's based on organisms having the capability of passing their genes on to the next generation. Now, again, I have to remind you that Charles Darwin did not know there was such thing as genetics, genes, or anything like that. He didn't actually know the method by which material got passed on to the next generation. But he did know that characteristics that were favorable in the parent could get passed on to the offspring and make it favorable in the offspring. So Charles Darwin drafted his ideas in 1842, is when his pretty much the entire manuscript of The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was finished in 1842. But he sat on it, and he did not publish it for 16 years. Now, there are, a lot of different people out there that suggest reasons why, etc. I think probably one of the main reasons that is accepted is that Charles Darwin, his wife, Emma Darwin, was devout Christian, and she was extremely religious. And Charles Darwin didn't want to disappoint his wife. That had nothing really to do with it per se. But he knew that when he published this, and it had nothing to do with religion, but he knew that when he published it, that the church would not accept it, and that he would be outcasted, and his family would be probably outcasted also with this publication. So I think that is a lot of the reason why Charles Darwin sat on this for 16 years. On top of that, though, he also sat on it for 16 years, and it wasn't like it just sat on the shelf. He sat on it so he could develop even more evidence. So the period between 1842 and 1858 was not just latent, like it sat on the shelf and he worked on something else. He was still working. He was still working on this book and other books for that matter, but he was still working on it and collecting more data and writing more letters and things like that. He wanted this to be as sound as possible. So the scientific community, because it's such a big idea, the scientific community would not reject it. But his hand was kind of forced in 1858 when Alfred Russel Wallace sent Charles Darwin an outline of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And in fact, like I said before, Wallace coined the term natural selection. Now, this was just a brief essay kind of outlining what Darwin had been writing about for roughly 16 years. Now, there are some people that will say that Wallace gave Darwin the idea and then Darwin ran with it. There are some people that will say that Darwin, because he was writing letters to everyone all over the world, could have let some of his information slip, and Wallace read one of those letters or got one of those letters, and that's how Wallace came up with natural selection and evolution. But right now, it's hard to say. We do know that Charles Darwin in 1842 had already drafted his ideas, and it wasn't until 1858 that Wallace came up with natural selection. So for the most part, we just assume that they came to it independently, and they both came up with a mechanism by which evolution can occur. Darwin, being a gentleman, in my opinion, decided that the best thing to do was for both individuals to read or present their material to the Linnaean Society in London. So the purpose or the point was for both of these individuals, Wallace and Darwin, to present their own ideas to the Linnaean Society and let the Linnaean Society make a judge on who's got more evidence or who came up with it first or how they want to proceed. Well, Wallace couldn't make it to London, and therefore he didn't present. He just sent his manuscript. He just sent his paper to the Linnaean Society. And Darwin couldn't make it either, because prior to this presentation, Darwin's daughter died, and he was heartbroken, and so he sent his ideas too, and they were read to the Linnaean Society. And as far as we can tell, based on what's been written, no one really cared. It didn't cause much of a outcry. It didn't cause much thinking, and no one really made a decision. So Charles Darwin decided to publish On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. Now this, on the other hand, did create a controversy. Okay? So when the publication came out, you got to remember this, during this time period, there was no radio, no TV, nothing like that. So you get all your information from books. And so anytime a new book was published, everyone read it, and including this book. And it sold out, many, many copies, continuously sold out, and people read it a lot. But it created a huge controversy. And mainly the controversy came around a single kind of passage near the end of the book, where Darwin suggested that, like all organisms, humans have a common ancestor, and that is apes. He didn't say monkeys, he said apes. And cartoonists and religious entities came out and outcried and bashed Charles Darwin in public and in writing for the book that he published. But it wasn't long, and the scientific community accepted Darwin's argument and then started working on either trying to refute it by developing experiments to test it, or trying to support it by developing experiments in support of it. And 200 years later, there's really been no documented scientific study that's ever refuted Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. So where did a lot of this information come from? A lot of the evidence come from? It really came from what we call Darwin's finches, or the Galápagos finches. We know that on the Galápagos Islands, there are a lot of finches. They're distinct species, but they are closely related. Their similarities are pretty much everything except for their bill shape. Okay? And Darwin noticed this after he was told that they were all finches. Okay? That, wow, this is a great deal of evidence here that these birds have different shaped bills, but they create similar nests, they have similar calls, they have similar plumage. It's really just the beak. And he assumed that they were eating separate things, and we'll get to that in a second. We now know, because of modern genetics, we now know the exact cause of the differences in beaks. Okay? And that is a gene that we call BMP4, which codes for a protein that lays down material on the beak of birds. Okay? And so birds with larger beaks, thicker beaks, will have more BMP4 turned on, or more protein turned on, and typically turned on at an earlier time in their life. Right? And then birds with smaller bills. Right? And so we can manipulate this. You can turn this gene off or turn it on, and you can create different bill shapes, sizes, etc., right? Because we now know the gene that causes these differences. Okay? So here you can see on a single island you might have 8 to 10 different finches, and so some that are feeding on things like seeds, and others that might be feeding on insects, and some that might be feeding on like vegetation. But nonetheless, they all have very different bill shapes. Okay? But the rest of the organism is very. So they all have different bill shapes, but the rest of the organism is very similar. Now you might say, oh, but look at this one here. He's got a much bigger head than this one. Well, yes, because if you have a giant bill, you're going to need to have much more muscle mass to work that bill. Right? And that's pretty much a given. We know that based on the physics of action, or bill action in that case. So an organism over here will probably have less muscle mass to work a smaller bill. That's a given. Now the bill itself is what we're interested in, not actually the head or the muscle mass, because the muscle mass can change over time. Okay, so it was this bill size that was really interesting to researchers even after Darwin's time. So Darwin suggested it, Darwin presented it, and really Darwin's finches was a guess though on Darwin's part, because he shot all these birds and he sent them off to be identified, and then he said that they all had a common ancestor that occurred on the mainland. He said that all of them, must be eating different things, but he never actually checked. And so when Darwin proposed this, that the birds were evolving to eat separate foods, different foods, and that they evolved from a single ancestor on the mainland, it was all still just a hypothesis. No one had tested it until David Lack's study. In 1938, David Lack came along, went to the Galápagos Islands, shot a bunch of birds, and looked at what they had been eating. And what he found was that they all pretty much eat the same kinds of seeds. So now here's this study by Lack in 38 that suggests, well, maybe they're not specialized on particular foods. They're eating the same feed, same kind of seed, no matter what the size of their bill is. And so the question really came about, well, is Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, at least for finches, is it wrong? Well, along came two researchers, Peter and Rosemary Grant, and they decided that they were going to look into Lack's issue or Lack's research, and they're going to do an extensive study of the medium ground finch on Daphne Major in the Galápagos. Okay, Daphne Major is an island in the Galápagos. And when I say extensive study, we're talking roughly 40 years of studying the medium ground finch. Okay? And it's probably more than 40 years because their grad students and other individuals that are associated with them have picked up the research. Peter and Rosemary Grant are fairly old right now. But others have picked up their research and have continued these studies on Daphne Major. So what did they do? They went to the island, and this is crazy. They went to the island. They stayed there for 3 months or so, 4 months at a time. They'd live in caves. There's no electricity on the island, so they had to bring their own food. They had to bring their own water in, and they would capture birds. And they'd measure their beak, and they'd do all kinds of things. Look at what they were eating, look at how many offspring they produced, measure their calls, look at the nesting material, all kinds of things. And they just kept track of these birds year after year after year. And what they found was, indeed, just like lax study, which was a very short period of time, finches do prefer small, tender seeds. But when drought periods come on, when those small, tender seeds go away, the finches that have the capability, they will switch to larger, harder to crack seeds, and the individuals that can't make that switch die off. So the beak depth, or the size of the bill, increased with an increase in those larger, harder seeds. Okay? And if you know much, maybe you don't know much, but seeds, soft seeds, tender seeds, typically are that way because they house a lot of water and they occur in wet environments. But if you want hard seeds and drought resistant seeds, they're going to have a hard shell on the outside and then a fleshy seed in the inside. Okay? So the more arid or drier the environment, the more hard seeds you're going to see than soft seeds. Soft seeds will dry up, okay? The tender seeds will lose a lot of water, and they won't be in existence. So what they found is, as you get dry years, about every three years or so, you get these dry year periods where beak depth on average is deeper than during wet years. And remember, we're talking about evolution here, not individuals changing. Okay, so evolution is population genetic change, not an individual change. Okay? So it's not like the birds are increasing their bills. So it's not like the birds are increasing their bill depth or decreasing their bill depth, but they're providing or producing offspring that either have deeper bills or smaller bills. Okay? And this fluctuates across years depending on the environment that is available. So Grant's work with the medium ground finch was the first documented example of what we call evolution in action. It was a way in which we could finally see evolution, population genetic change, or population change over a human's lifespan. And so it took a long time. It took many years of Peter and Rosemary's life to document this, but nonetheless, they did document that these populations were changing, their genetics were changing, their beak depths were changing, okay? And it was evolution in action. We now have lots and lots of examples of evolution in action due to Peter and Rosemary Grant's work, okay? But nonetheless, it was one of the very first research projects to do this. Okay? Again, what they found was that the average beak depth increases after a drought, okay? And that's because the small seeds are gone and there's only large seeds left. So individuals that can break those seeds can eat those seeds, they can pass on their genes to the next generation. When wet periods return, the small beaks come back because small beaks are easier to use to handle smaller seeds, and so they can outcompete the large beaked individuals. And so the population fluctuates over time. Okay? So from that, we can then suggest something called adaptive radiation. Okay? And Darwin's finches are a good example of this. Adaptive radiation is when you get an ancestral species or an ancestral population moving or migrating to a new region, a different habitat. And it doesn't mean that they have to move. It could be that we have, some kind of tropical storm, or you could have a volcano explode. You could have some kind of natural natural disaster that changes the environment. Okay? But at any rate, a lot of times the populations migrate to a different habitat, and then when they're in that different habitat, they have the ability to change rapidly, okay? And they adapt to the different habitat very quickly, causing one species or maybe a couple species to become lots of species. Okay? Now, what they're adapting to is what we call ecological niches. Okay? An ecological niche is a region in which a species can inhabit and is specialized to or has adapted to. Okay? A niche, it consists of both abiotic or non-living things like temperature, humidity, the days of frost, and these kind of things. But it also includes biotic communities. So what are the plants available? What are the microbes? What are other animals doing? Okay? And so you take into account both biological and abiological, and you can get these little microhabitats, which we call niches. And species will adapt to a given niche. And so when we look at evolution, evolution occurs around niches, small inhabited places where species can adapt to. And we'll talk about niche competition and things like that when we talk about ecology, but there's some things around niches that are important, like, for example, no two organisms can occupy the same niche because of competition. So you'll get competition around that niche, and you get organisms that move away, and they'll go to a new niche and develop around that or adapt to that new niche. Okay. The other thing that this is done, modern technology has allowed us to do, is examine the phylogenetic linkage between Galapagos finches. Okay? So Darwin suggested that Galapagos finches are the result of a single ancestor making it to the Galapagos Islands and then giving rise to all these other birds. Okay? But it was a hypothesis until modern technology came around, and we could look at the genetics of these organisms, and we can see that indeed the base of the tree is an ancestral finch that occurs in Ecuador. Okay? The rest of these organisms that are very similar, they lump together. So the ground finches and the cactus finches, they lump together. The tree finches lump together. The warbler finches lump together, and then the vegetarian finch is off on its own. So you see that modern genetics, which is very useful in evolutionary studies, has basically just reiterated that Darwin was correct. His hypothesis was correct, that these organisms indeed went through an adaptive radiation. They came from an ancestral species on the mainland. Somehow they got to the island, tropical storm probably, okay? And then they adapted. And the adaptation is coming around ecological niches. So if you have a cactus finch, it's because that niche was open and that bird took advantage of it, and on and on and on. Okay? So with that, next time we're going to talk about evidence for evolution. We're going to talk about what was the evidence that Charles Darwin put forth, but also what is modern evidence. Okay? So Darwin had quite a bit of evidence, but remember, Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know anything about proteins. Okay? And that's some of the greatest evidence for evolution that we have comes in the genes, the genetics, and the proteins that are coded for it. All right, next time we'll we'll talk about evidence of evolution.